Welcome to the session on structure and strategy. I think as promised with one well-seasoned social entrepreneur and two hopefully plain-speaking lawyers. So it's my honor to introduce to you Todd Johnson and John Sage. I was asked by the planning committee for the conference to put together a panel on legal structure and was told to shoot for the moon. And so I sat down, and the two people that I was most interested in having come and speak to you today are sitting in front of you now. So that's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to moderate this discussion. Today we're going to be focusing a lot on story, a lot of narrative of experiences that have been had by the three of us, primarily by the two of them, and what that means for aspiring entrepreneurs, for people who are in the mid stages of their businesses, for students who are potentially looking at eventually getting into business for good, or whatever title you prefer to apply to it. And we'll be covering some structural issues. But for the most part, the details are things that are easier to read online. We're going to tell you stories. If you want details, find me afterward. Look up our blogs. That you can read boring legal code there. That's not what we're here for today. So Todd Johnson is an attorney with Jones Day. He founded the Silicon Valley office in, I believe, 2000, and he currently heads up the global sustainable energy practice, and has been an attorney in a variety of public and private companies, and has advised the B Labs in some of the work around B Corp, brand mark, and benefit corporation legislation, and more recently has worked on flexible purpose corporation legislation in California. John Sage is the founder of Pura Vida coffee, which many of you are familiar with, and in more recent stage, he's now with 6H Consulting, where he does consulting with a variety of high-performance organizations, large names, Microsoft, Disney, Starbucks, etc. So let's get into it. We'll have the joy of getting to pass the mic as we go, so just be patient with us as that happens. We wanted to set the stage today, a bit of a global picture brought down to the reality of what this world is that we're living in. So we're going to look at a few slides on what it would be if there was only 100 people in the entire world. So when we look at some of these sobering pictures and statistics on what it would be like if the world was down to 100 people, it puts it in a whole different light, makes the numbers, the millions that we hear of, something we can wrap our mind around for a second. So it's not meant to be a downer, but to set the stage properly for what we're talking about. I think the three of us have a belief that business has the potential to be an incredible force for good in this world. To address some of the inequities that we see when we look at those slides. So we're going to talk about people who have tried to do that, people who have done it successfully, people who have failed forward, and hopefully there'll be some meaning and takeaways for you in the conversation. So what do we mean when we talk about this? Here's some terms: venture philanthropy, social enterprise, social venture, benefit corporation. triple bottom line, purpose-driven, mission-driven, doing well and doing good. These are all terms that people throw out and around in this space. We are not defining social entrepreneurship today. We're not defining social venture, but we're floating around these terms. So go ahead and take a look at them. Think about what they mean, what they capture, what they say, what they don't say.
I think in the simplest way possible, the way I think about this and have thought about it ever since I met John Sage and started working with him 8 or 9 years ago, we have actually done ourselves a huge disservice. We've managed to create corporate forms that maximize creating wealth and corporate forms that maximize doing good. And the odd thing about this is, if you think about it, the way I think about it, it takes a lot of head and strength up here to get on this part of the axis. It takes a lot of heart and soul over here. And if I think about myself, I never walk around as two of me, one heart and soul, one head and strength. I'm totally integrated as one person. And the idea that the organizational reflection of human beings is to bifurcate them is craziness. And this is sort of where I started. I started on my journey about 11 or 12 years ago thinking about these things and working with some young entrepreneurs. And what I realized is we were lacking a good structure for optimizing the straight path. I mean, the odd thing is that a lot of nonprofits are doing earned income strategies and other kinds of efforts to try to maximize and leverage capital, but they're blocked in terms of how far they can go. They can't move up that scale too far because the Internal Revenue Code says so. And likewise, you have lots of things like corporate philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, or interesting corporate models like 1-1-1 models, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But corporations, for a host of reasons, including directors' fiduciary duties, are limited in terms of how far they can go on that side of the spectrum. And what we see today, up until the last couple of years, is really everybody's trying to bend the arc. They're trying to get there around the corners when we just know, we learned this in kindergarten, right? The shortest distance between 2 points is the straight line. So the question is, how do you build a straight line to that place where you're optimizing the head and strength part and the heart and soul part rather than trying to maximize one or the other? And I think the challenge, of course, is that to do that means that you've got to live in a tension of some opposites that haven't traditionally, or at least for the past 100 years, traditionally been mixed together.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Brian. Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm delighted to have the chance to share some thoughts and reflections and some sort of war stories from the front lines of trying to bring together sort of the rigor and the discipline and the bottom line mindedness of business and capitalism with more of the tender-hearted, mission-minded sense of a great charitable organization. And in fact, those tensions that Todd and Brian spoke about have been with us probably from the very beginning. And in fact, we can go back more than 2,000 years, and the first real example of this tension that we're going to talk about today, I think, is found in one verse from Matthew. It's the 10th chapter, verse 16. Jesus is sending his disciples out into the community to preach the word and to cast out demons, and he tells his disciples that they are not to bring money, food, clothing, or a cloak, or even a staff. And instead, he gives them one piece of advice. He says, "Be ye therefore as shrewd as serpents and as gentle as doves." He doesn't say, be as shrewd as a serpent in the morning and in the afternoon be as gentle as a dove, or be as shrewd as a serpent if that's what the circumstances demand. It's be both. It's both and together and at the same time. And in that tension, the disciples find great power. And that idea of holding opposites together, things that seem like they don't belong together, was a pivotal verse and a pivotal concept for Martin Luther King. He preached a sermon at the very outset of the civil rights movement that was entitled "Tough-Minded and Tender-Hearted." And that whole sermon keyed off of that one verse in Matthew. And this was how he began the sermon, with this quote. I just think it's great. He says, "The strong man holds in a living blend strongly marked opposites. The idealists are seldom realistic. The realists are seldom idealistic. The militant are not generally known to be passive, nor the passive to be militant. Seldom are the humble self-assertive, or the self-assertive humble. But life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites together in fruitful harmony." Life at its best is a fruitful synthesis of opposites in harmony. And so that idea that there's power that's unleashed when we find ways to hold things together that seem like they don't belong together, for me, is at the foundation of everything that I was trying to achieve with Pura Vida. And thankfully, through the love and support and legal brilliance of my brother Todd here, we were able to, I was going to say, discover some new truths, but I like the idea of failing forward, because we made far more mistakes than we had triumphs, and yet by God's grace and Todd's legal support, the company continues to go on, and in fact, SPU has been one of our best customers and one of our earliest customers from the very beginning. I just gave a talk last week at Eastern University with Tony Campolo to a bunch of students, and so some of these slides are from that. And one of the things I wanted to engage with the students on is sort of, how do you find that power? How do you experience the power that comes from bringing together those strongly marked opposites in a synthesis, in fruitful harmony? And I'm going to just share a couple of thoughts with you. I think when you're asking yourself, for your own purposes, where am I going to go and how am I going to use the talents I've been given? One of the first things you have to do is to sort of identify what are those strongly marked opposites that I'm trying to reconcile. Do I even know what they are? And very typically, you don't. You have to assess and think about where they can come from. And in my instance, and I think this is true for a lot of people, when you're trying to kind of map this for your own life, you look back to your own experiences. Where did you grow up, and what were the early influences that you had? What were the motivations or the tensions that you felt as a kid? I had this challenge. I wasn't exactly sure this slide was going to be in here until about 10 minutes ago, but this serves no purpose other than to get you laughing. But no, this one of my challenges or tensions was having bad hair and tinted aviator glasses. But actually, I grew up in Berkeley in the 70s, which was a time of upheaval and social activism. And so for me, my tensions really are found in my growing up with activist parents who really believed very strongly that social justice and economic justice weren't sort of these abstract concepts, but you actually got out and you did stuff. And in the day, most of the activism you would take was all about, what do you say no to? What could you reject? What do you denounce? And so we went driving down and protested the Vietnam War, and my mother was driving a '64 Impala station wagon with my brother and me, trying to roll the windows up before the tear gas came in. And then we'd go and walk a picket line with Cesar Chavez, and it was no to grapes, and no to lettuce, and no to this, and no to that. And yet there was one small problem. I really liked to make money. I loved business. I was that annoying kid who had paper routes and lemonade stands, and my parents didn't really know what to do with me. And it always felt like those two things just could never come together. You could pendulum swing all the way over here and be on a picket line and protesting and pushing down the man, and then over here you'd come back and say, well, I'd like to make some money and I'd like to do well. I went on to business school following my undergrad. I went to a Harvard Business School, which, as you might imagine, is a place that places a very high degree of importance on money. First day in class, 90 students all sitting there very scared because we knew that 5% of every class was forcibly kicked out at the end of the year. The professor pulls a dollar bill out and looks at it and then rips it and throws it down like that. and then walks to the side and says, I love this place. Where else but at Harvard Business School could I buy the silence of 90 MBAs for just $1? It had that effect, right? Everybody was quiet, and then there was a big fight to see who'd get the pieces. And if you were looking for a place to go to work that would reinforce that cultural expectation of business, my win is your loss. I can only win and succeed if I make you fail. It's very zero-sum. It's very binary. Where else would you go in the late 80s to reinforce those notions of business and being binary, right? Well, this little software company called Microsoft, and I went there. I had the good fortune of working with Steve Ballmer early on. I remember my first week, we had email that said everybody out by Lake Bill. Didn't know what Lake Bill was, but walked outside, and there was Steve Ballmer, and he got us all chanting, and we were chanting death to Novell, death to Novell, and I'd never heard of Novell. I didn't know. I thought it was a person, and then this big structure next to him that was shrouded in a curtain, he took the curtain off, and it was a guillotine, a real guillotine, and he started to pull the blade up, and where your head would go was a box of Novell netware. And then as we're chanting death to Novell, he lets it go, and the box splits open. And, the scary thing is I still get shivers thinking about that. It was really intoxicating, but it was all about win, win, win. We're driving for share. We're going to go, go, go. And there was really very little room to be reminded of those days in Berkeley, those feelings of, wow, what about the people who aren't here, who aren't this fortunate? That was almost sort of a distant memory. And, for many, I think a viable strategy is to say, well, right now I need to be all about what I'm about. And if that means making money, Bill Gates used to say, don't bother me with talk about philanthropy. I'm not even going to talk about it until I'm 50. Because it's hard enough to make money, it's 10 times harder to give it away effectively. Reasonable thought, not one that I tend to agree with, but this search for balance and blend and trying to somehow hold on to those things at the same time, for me, was manifested in the creation of Pura Vida Coffee. This is my friend and co-founder, Chris Dernley. We met at business school, and Chris had worked in microfinance before business school. He had felt a real call on his life to return to Central America, to try to find ways to apply his business and his finance skills on behalf of the poor living in Central America. And the origins of Pura Vida grew out of the many conversations I had with him while I was at Microsoft. He's down there finding ways to scrounge up money to buy food so that he can feed teens and give people an alternative after school, an alternative to life of prostitution or dealing drugs. And, every year I'd write a check or send him stock. And, it was a very traditional philanthropic model, support the missionary, fund the money. And yet I could see the amount of time and energy that was being consumed as he figured out how he was going to raise his budget every year. And we just thought, wow, what if we could start a business and use the profits from that to support the work that you're doing. We'd use the web as a way to conduct the transaction and tell the stories. And he said, oh, that's great. We could call it Pura Vida. It means pure life. That's how we greet one another in our country. So we launched the coffee company. I was gone out of Microsoft for some time by now. Didn't really know what we were doing. Didn't respect the physics of the coffee business, as we'll talk about later. And so we started this business. We had some early success. I flew down to see how things were going in Costa Rica. I got off the plane. Everywhere I went, people were saying, oh, Pura Vida, Pura Vida. And I thought, wow, we're doing pretty well. My next venture will be launching a brand of coffee in Hawaii called Aloha. And, one of the things I'm going to talk to you about a little bit later that I want you to be watching for as an impediment and an obstacle to successful blending of these opposites is success. particularly early success, and particularly if you're a person of faith, it's very easy to see success as affirmation and validation and the moving of the Holy Spirit and the sign that you're on the right road and blessing and provision. And it may very well be that, but you just need to be really, really careful. We had early success. We had great press and coverage. We had a lot of momentum. The fair trade organic movement had just barely begun. And we just rode that. And it was really intoxicating, and it felt like, wow, it's all coming together, cylinders firing, business and mission, and what could be better than finding it kind of all come together? For me, I tend to be more comfortable in a North American hard-charging business mentality. It was very easy to get caught up in the business, and yet it was super important for me to be able to go to origin and to be reminded of why we were even doing this. I guess that's another word I would have for you is, take time and consciously cultivate and reinforce the reasons why you're drawn into this work. I took a trip to Guatemala, and I just will tell a quick story here because it really reminded me how far I had come from being connected to really the true stakeholders in this business. I was down to help. We had a reporter traveling with us, the religion editor from the Seattle Times. And, we were down there to see the work and talk to Chris, and I was going to lead the big soccer game, and then we were going to have lunch. And this reporter, Sally McDonald, had a reporter notebook, those little spiral things, and she was surrounded by these kids, dozens and dozens of kids. And, I'm kind of the impatient North American MBA, and I'm, going, we're late. Come on, we're supposed to be getting the soccer game together, and then we're going to have lunch. And, what are those kids doing? And they just stayed, just glommed around her, and she just, and this just kept going and going and going. It's 15, 20, 25 minutes. And I finally said to my translator who was with me, said, what is going on? And he said, I'm not exactly sure, but I bet that she's writing their names down. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, most of these kids, they never hear their own name. And what they hear is, and then he used Spanish that I didn't understand that meant donkey and worse. And he said, so for these kids to think that they're important enough for somebody from the United States, a reporter, who will take the time to write down their own name, he said, that means so much more to them than any soccer game, any meal. And sure enough, that night when we were debriefing, Sally, who'd been a religion reporter for 20 years, pulled out this notebook, and she's just going through it, and she's reading the names, and she bursts into tears. And she says, this is the most meaningful professional day of my life. And in that was just a great reminder to me, like, wow, just allow yourself a moment to see what's happening here and give it a rest on the business side. So just a few questions that I'd ask you to be thinking about now as we kind of continue on this morning. What are you doing to cultivate and to nurture or explore your opposites? So remember, the first question is, what do you think they are? And that takes self-reflection, introspection, prayer. It takes feeding in from other people who know you. And maybe you don't have twin opposites, and that's cool too. Once you've sort of got an eye on them, then what I find a lot of the questions I get from college students or grad students is, I'm not sure what I ought to do. Should I go and work over here at IBM or Microsoft or Google and hone my skills and make money, or should I just jump right into my mission field? And I've got a bias. I think you become only more valuable as you've accumulated practical skills, wisdom, and resources. I really do. It's not to say those of you who are called immediately into the service field shouldn't follow that call, but I am really, really thankful I spent sort of a decade of apprenticeship at Microsoft and then working for Paul Allen and then working for Starbucks. Invaluable insights used every day. And the financial freedom that came with that enabled me to fund a lot of the mistakes early on before I used other people's money to fund my mistakes. So I would just, with a sense of real humility, but also forceful opinion encourage you to be patient and to allow yourself time to cultivate those things. And then be very mindful of the hurdles that are going to keep you from combining these opposites effectively. And Todd's going to give you a really nice, full sense of where those challenges are going to be. I would suggest there are a few sort of meta or big ones in my mind. We've already talked about one, early success. Number two, which actually ought to be number one, is hubris. And hubris is a great word, and I'd encourage you to exegete on it. It doesn't just mean pride. It means an overconfidence in your abilities or an unplaced optimism, not rooted in reality. Right? So in a weird way, entrepreneurs and people who are risk-oriented have to have a high degree of confidence. They have to have irrational optimism, or they wouldn't attempt these crazy things. So I'm grateful to my parents for sort of having instilled this idea in me that, single-handedly I could reform capitalism. Well, great, I mean, you believe your mom, right? And yet you want to guard against it. And we'll have some thoughts for you about how you do that. You want to also be mindful of fear. As you wade in deeper, as you see time and money invested in something you care passionately about, it can be harder and harder to unwind or to step back and reflect and ask hard questions. And that can be very fearful. You can have advisors and loved ones and friends who they think you're out of your mind. And they tell you, are you crazy? Why not just go to Wall Street? Get a safe job. What about the benefits, right? And so that can amplify the fears that you may already have, right? So these are some of the things that I hope you'll be mindful of as you go. And, the ways that you will prepare and anticipate and be able to preempt some of these things, I think you will find in a few things, and we'll have a chance to talk more about that too. You want to cultivate humility. You want to invite others who will help you cultivate that humility. You want to pray unceasingly. And you want to really allow yourself to experience grace. And I know that sounds like one of those things like, yeah, right. Hopefully if we have time, I'll give you a story or two about what that looks like. And I don't mean grace like, the substitutionary atonement is the source of my salvation and therefore my grace. I mean like, wow, what does it feel like when you have wronged someone and they say, don't worry about it? That feeling, and I would encourage each of you to try to think of a moment where you experience it, because you've got to hold on to that. Because the last thing I'll say before I hand it off here is if you're walking down this road, you're going to fail. Absolutely. It's only a question of how dramatically, how quickly, and sort of how severely the collateral damage is. Right? So just know that at the beginning. It's an absolute certainty. The purpose of our time here together today, I think, is to try to equip you to be able to spot some of the sources of failure and then to give you a few things to hold on to that will hopefully get you to failure quicker, make it less painful, and reduce the collateral damage to sort of an acceptable amount. Okay. All right. So I'll turn it over to my good friend Todd, and we'll keep pushing ahead here.
The first time I ever met John, I was his warm-up act. We were speaking, and I was supposed to give the 5-minute front-end talk, and he was going to give the real talk. And so I've never had to follow him since then, and I'm a little intimidated by trying to do that now. I think my goal is to try to give a few watchwords in a way that's organized that provides practical thinking around some of the issues that I'm familiar with in working with companies that have been sort of slogging away at the bottom of the pyramid. And my first interaction was with a class that came out with a group of students that came out of a class at Stanford. The first year they had this class 8 years ago called Entrepreneurial Design for Extreme Affordability. And this class has gotten a lot of press these days, but these students came out and they had a solar-powered LED flashlight that they wanted to sell for 25 bucks in India because most people in India are off the grid. They spend about $15 a month on kerosene. The rural poor are, spending on a non-renewable resource that is polluting their house and making their kids sick and burning their children. About 5% of children were being burned by kerosene lamps tipped over. It was a great idea, and they came to me and they said, should we be a for-profit or a nonprofit? And I said, what a great question. I'll bet that question's been asked 1,000,000 times before. No one's ever asked me, so why don't we get some people who are smarter than me and have better experiences together and we'll have dinner. And I picked up the phone and called John Sage right away and said, John, I know you've struggled with this before. Who can we get together for dinner? And so we had about, 10, 15 people for dinner at Celia's on El Camino down in Palo Alto. And at the end of the night, after lots of great thinking and talking, I realized no one has the answer. And the problem is it's a false question, right? It starts from the wrong premise, that it's an either or. The entrepreneur shouldn't be faced with the either or. They should be faced with the how do I build this enterprise that's going to have integrity. And I use the word integrity not so much from the moral imperative perspective, but I use it the way I think of I want my bicycle tires to have integrity when I'm flying 45 miles an hour down the hills, right? I want them to be whole and complete and sturdy. I want them to do the job they're made to do. And if we're thinking in terms of integrity, and we're thinking about organizations that have integrity, what should they be doing? And I think a lot of people talk in terms of triple bottom lines or people, profit, planet, or people, planet, profit. I think that's the right order. But ideally, the wealth creation is just a part of human flourishing. And it's a part of human stewardship of the earth and the planet. And how do we make life more sustainable for 6+ billion people that are here today, but the 9+ billion that are going to be here in 30 years. And so the questions that I've struggled with have been all around how do you do this? And I've just come away with 10 lessons learned. And they're simple lessons, and we'll try to tell some stories around them. I would encourage you not to spend your time writing because they're all on the deck, and you'll be able to email Brian afterwards. His email address will be up there, and he can send you a PDF of our deck today. So maybe gives you more time to sit and think. So 10 things you need to know at the bottom of the pyramid. This one I learned from John, actually. Your investors and philanthropists are generally the same person. They just think with the left brain and right brain, or as John says, with the left pocket and right pocket. He tells the story of going into people trying to encourage them to invest in Pura Vida. And they'd say, look, I'd give you $10,000 because what you're doing is really cool. Or I'd invest $100,000, but I'm not sure it's really a full investment thing. And you're making my head hurt, so go find someone else. And that's just a reality and something that you need to take on board at the front end, because the biggest challenge for any entrepreneur is how do you cover the soft startup, the soft costs of startup. And housing it in a nonprofit has a whole bunch of baggage attached to it when you want to take it into the for-profit realm later. And trying to do it purely for-profit with a social mission has the challenge of finding investors who can think with their whole brain. Number 9 is simply that every organization needs a good guardian and a good taskmaster. And I think this goes to John's idea of the tensions and the opposites. I have to find my opposites because I tend to be sort of myopic in my tendencies. My wife says I'm really bad at follow-through, and I always say, that's why I married you, honey. My wife scores 100% in the J category on Myers-Briggs. She gets stuff done, and never 10 minutes from now. She gets it done now. If it can possibly be done now, she gets it done now. I like to think about the big picture, take off my shoes, sit in the sun, think visions, encourage people, connect them, and then something will happen, I'm sure. And this is why we're good together. And what I've realized is one of the powerful things of opposites in these kinds of businesses is the guardian of the mission and the taskmaster are often not the same people. The investor, because you're using their money, is going to be really harsh on the accountability side. They may not be so good on the guardianship side of your mission. And these are just 4 faces out of this Stanford class, people I've been working with for the last 10 years. There's great stories about each one of them, but they are different ones of them, taskmasters or guardians. David Kelly is the founder of IDEO. Jim Patel is a professor at Stanford GSB. Erica Estrada is one of the students that came out of that class and is just an incredible encourager for other students who are launching these kinds of businesses. And David Beach is a design professor at Stanford and also great at sort of design, innovative thinking, encouraging people to think out of the box and go create. But there's a definite yin and yang across the axis here. Number 8 is to be aware that ape will kill your mission every day. Gary Hamel likes to say that bad habits will eat good strategies for lunch any day. And the biggest bad habit I have, and I tend to think that most human beings have, is that we've got an ego that often takes us to a place of pride, especially when we have success, which leads to that hubris or arrogance that makes us think that we know better and we're going to do it better, and especially around the issue of success. So my cautionary notes are similar to John's. Beware of early success, because it will grow the ape. And don't be afraid to take some bracketing shots. I find a lot of entrepreneurs, while they're not as risk averse as I am, I'm a lawyer, for God's sakes. I'm trained to be risk averse, so they couldn't be more risk averse than me, but they're still risk averse. And what I always say to them is, you need to value failure and be willing to do what they did in World War II when they didn't have GPS systems to call in the shots on the battleships. They had airplanes and guys who looked down with really fancy equipment and would say, okay, shoot long, shoot short, and then we won't waste any munition trying, because the next shot will be a direct hit. We can triangulate from the short and the long. And I've really come to believe that being willing to have right-sized experiments that can fail without capsizing the mission is critically important to success, and I'll talk a little bit about why later on. But you can't do that if you're not willing to take some bracketing shots. You're not going to hone in on how to do it better. And then finally, it goes to John's point about humility. I find that this is such a relatively new space that young people are teaching old people, and old people are teaching middle-aged people, and middle-aged people are teaching young people. Everyone's a teacher. No one's got a corner on this market. And so approaching it with a certain amount of humility, especially in the face of success, that I've got a lot to learn, I find is really important to making a business at the bottom of the pyramid succeed. Okay, so I'm going to take on a sacred cow possibly, but let me just tell you, I've been 7 times to Ethiopia in the last 5 years. And I know a little bit of something about malnutrition. I've spent a lot of time trying to help foster better models for education and entrepreneurship for kids. And one of the things I know is that kids can't learn and succeed if they're not fed. But I also have learned that feeding kids does not necessarily mean that they're going to be nourished. And part of the reason is that these kids, a lot of them have parasites. And so no matter how much they eat, they're not getting nourished. So I learned that deworming kids is not necessarily going to keep them from being malnourished either. Because if they're running around barefoot in the fields, in the dung patties, they're going to get parasites again as soon as they're dewormed. So I've learned that in order for kids in Ethiopia to learn, they need shoes. It's critical. It's absolutely imperative. They have to have them, because they'll never be nourished enough and vibrant enough to be able to really learn and become their full potential. So why would I put a Tom's Shoes thing up here when I'm talking about unintended negative consequences? Well, the reason I do is because I think I came across this story by a guy named Dwayne Elmer called The Parable of the Monkey. The monkey, it lives on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean. Huge hurricane hits, and the monkey realizes afterwards that there are sea fish trapped in tidal pools that are evaporating, and these fish will surely die. So at great risk and effort, great risk to itself, the monkey climbs across fallen trees and lowers itself down by its tail, and very gently, very carefully, with great care, scoops each fish up one at a time, walks them back down across the fallen tree, and lays them gently on the beach, and experiences great joy as he sees the fish jumping around, and then a sense of ultimate satisfaction when he sees the piece of the fish simply lying on the beach. Our intentions can be so pure, but especially in a cross-cultural context, the unintended consequences can be devastating. And the challenge here, of course, is that Tom's makes most of their shoes not in Africa, but they give a lot of them away in Africa. The buy one, give one model. I've come to say BOGO should be no-go. The buy one, give one model means they're handing out shoes in Africa, and I've come in contact directly with the shoemaker entrepreneurs who are losing business in Ethiopia. So this isn't to say that this is bad. This is great. But part of doing business at the bottom of the pyramid means we've got to be constantly thinking through not just what is good, but how do I know what is good? How do I measure what is good? And what is the whole ecosystem around how I might go about fixing what is wrong and making it better? And what are the unintended consequences? My own personal experience with this is in my travels. We ended up in a village called Rogi Village. One of the guys that was with us was a hydrologist. He realized very quickly the women are walking 2 hours each way to get water every day for their family. And I think we could put a well in here. I think there's water here. And sure enough, they put a well in. There is water there. This is the water tower at Rogi Village. They've got drip irrigation going now. The kids are cleaner, less infection. The crops are growing even in the dry season. It's all really good, except there's been this massive explosion of babies. I mean, they couldn't even feed and teach the kids they had, and their population has almost doubled in the last 5 years just from a baby explosion. In part because kids are living longer, that's good. In part because women aren't spending 3 or 4 hours a day walking to get water. And men are having better success in their crops and able to sell some of them. And we've created this sort of ecosystem where there's been success in one place, but nothing else to sort of deal with other unintended consequences. My sixth thing that every entrepreneur at the bottom of the pyramid should be thinking about is that you got to take some of the leadership training that you got in business school or that you've read in Peter Drucker books or elsewhere, and you got to start to turn some of it on its head. Because now you're thinking about running an organization that is mixing money and meaning. And what I like to say, using the risk chip as my guide from Silicon Valley, is that leadership is less about authority in this kind of situation than it is about responsibility. And the responsibility is a responsibility to every single person in the organization, growing them, empowering them, trying to help them become the flourishing individual that they can be within the organization. And I remember having the conversation with John. When's the last time you went around and talked to your employees and asked them, how sustainable does your work life feel right now? It's an important piece of the puzzle. And responsibility to the overall mission, responsibility to those that you're serving outside, and thinking in terms of service, thinking in terms holistically of integrity and what that means, the wholeness and completeness that I was talking about before, and also valuing community. Having spent 23 years in a massive law firm, I'm very cognizant of the fact that my partners and I oftentimes will look at a secretary who stopped to talk to another secretary about what she or she did over the weekend, and we're like thinking, man, they're just not getting it done, this is crazy. But my wife reminds me that I spend more of my waking hours with my colleagues at work than I do with her. And that's only if I'm working 40 hours a week. And that we need community. We need each other. And so the real question becomes, how do we foster community in our organizations? And really it means that we've got to take the industrial paradigm of efficiency and turn it on its head. We've got to start allowing and empowering the idea of community. Number 5 is transparency really does matter. It matters more in this kind of an organization than anywhere else, because most people look at this as a continuum. You're dialing more towards mission, you're dialing away from money. Or you're dialing more towards money, you're dialing away from mission. And I don't believe that that has to be true. I think there's a blending that's possible where you can be optimizing both. But the suspicion is always going to be there. And that means you need to be transparent. And more than just being transparent and reporting regularly, you need to be willing to report bad news immediately. And this is a very humbling thing. John and I have lived through this kind of thing in our own organizations when we've had leadership roles, and we've spent some very long phone calls with one another, sort of supporting each other in those places where it's like, wow, I really screwed this up, and I didn't tell people, and it's incredibly humbling to have people say, yeah, you did. You really did screw it up, but don't worry about it. And I think his comment about grace and sort of learning to be able to accept grace as part of what's going to happen, what you're going to need in your toolkit to make one of these companies succeed, I think is really important. Number 4 is prenuptials make good sense. And I mean, I'm sorry, folks, but even the best laid plans will go awry. In fact, I like to tell founders, plan for everything but success. Okay? And part of that means that you can't deny that there's going to be changing of roles over time. Someone's going to rise, someone's not going to rise. And you started out all for one for all, the 2, 3, 4 musketeers. And guess what? Those roles are going to change. And people's egos are going to get bruised. And there's nothing wrong with stopping now and asking some of the unhappy what ifs. In fact, it's a whole lot better to stop now at the front end and ask them before you're in the emotional milieu of all those bruised egos. And so I really do emphasize with my founders to sit down and go through and put in place a founders agreement that deals with, what if you leave? What if I leave? What if you need liquidity? Who do you go to? How do you get it? What if you find someone who wants to buy your stock? Do I get to participate in that sale, or do I get to buy first? All those kinds of things that if you get them sorted out on the front end, make a huge difference when they actually come up. I wish Mel Gibson wish he had thought about it. Number 3 is so obvious, but I feel like it really needs to be stated. The bottom of the pyramid equals a really hard place. And what I would say to you is that building a company is hard work. Solving a major social problem is nearly impossible. I mean, we've got decades and decades and decades of people trying different solutions to eliminate extreme poverty, empower women, teach kids. Cross-cultural sensitivity, there's no way to do it quickly. It just takes time. You've got to be willing to go, instead of, I used to think that service was the end. That was the thing I was trying to achieve. That was the ultimate. Again, another writer sort of tuned me into the idea that that's actually the first step on a multi-step path, which takes you to humility. You start with the idea that you want to serve, but you can't serve until you can understand. And you can't understand until you're prepared to learn about, with, and from somebody else. You can't learn from somebody else and with somebody else until you can establish an area of openness and trust, which only happens when you're prepared to be totally humble and say, as I think it was Carl Sagan who said that the only thing I know is my own ignorance. And I think when we enter into sort of cross-cultural relationships that way, I think it is bound to go, more likely to go right than it is if we say, I'm here to serve you. And that's before you ever get to the fact that a lot of these places don't have a good rule of law. There's a lack of education. People's basic needs aren't being met. And whenever you have those three things overlapping with one another, you've got human exploitation going on, largely because there's corruption. The number two thing is that structure does matter. And I'll bet you thought, coming to hear a couple of lawyers talk, you were going to get a big primer on how to form your company. And we thought about that, and we have about 30 slides yet to come.
Oh, we realized we could bill you for it.
So what I would say quickly, and I will fly through, we really do have a bunch of slides, and I'll just fly through them really fast, only to say that there are a bunch of things that people have been trying before to bend those arcs. There's some new things that are on the horizon or have come into being in the last couple of years. And I think they all will start to make a difference, but we haven't found the Holy Grail yet. And in particular, there are sort of these corporate philanthropy models, the nonprofit gambit. You build a business within a nonprofit. Embrace. This is the company that came out of the Stanford class that's gotten a lot of play on 2020 in different places. $200,000 incubators don't make it into rural areas of the developing world. And so there's a much higher infant mortality rate in rural areas than there is in urban areas, because at least where there's a hospital, they're likely to have an incubator. So babies are dying in a couple of days because they can't be kept warm. So this group of students created a $200 incubator. It's a pouch with a wax thing that fits in the back that gets heated up and uses sort of basic physics to keep the child at body temperature. And it's saving lives. There are some problems with the traditional models of philanthropy, sort of nonprofit. There's the challenge of sustainability. It's the treadmill of always going and asking for more money. There's always the bad choices that have to get made. You know, as my friend Jim Patel likes to say, yeah, you opened up a school in Ethiopia, you got 50 kids that now get to go to school. What about the 51st? What about the 52nd? What about the other kids in the village who aren't getting to go to school? And it's a great question to ask. There is a lack of efficiency because oftentimes in a philanthropic model, you don't have the taskmaster. I mean, you do, but it's not the same as you're using my money. And I think there is some lack of efficiency as a result. There's also the tyranny of the good heart. I can't tell you the number of social entrepreneurs that I've talked to before who've said, oh, that's okay, our costs aren't going to be as much as our for-profit competitors because people want to come and work for us. They don't really want to make money. They're willing to make a lot less and do good.
Including our lawyers, right?
I mean, it's a challenge, and that there's a certain tyranny in that. I've started to ask, well, what do the beneficiaries think of that? Have you ever gone and talked to the people who are the beneficiaries of your philanthropy and said, hey, we're going to get cut rate work from people. We're going to hire people who may not be the best of the best because they're willing to come and do it because they're doing good. What do they think? And is that really the right model? And there's a lack of wholeness and completeness, a lack of the shalom or integrity. There are the side-by-side models, for-profit and nonprofit working next to each other. John could give you a full exegesis on the challenges of running a side-by-side, as Pura Vida Coffee was. There's the, started with Salesforce.com, and he evangelized it, the founder of Salesforce evangelized it to Google. It's you give away 1% of your equity, 1% of your employee time, and 1% of your profits. And it's a pretty powerful thing when you think about Google.org getting funded with $1 billion of Google stock. But it does cause some people to say, really, 1%? There's companies that are all about the product, you know, whether it's Ignite Innovations and D-Light that are selling to the bottom of the pyramid, or it's Good Guide that's put something up that is basically consumer reports online. Patagonia and the sort of full life cycle of the products and thinking it through cradle to cradle style, Bill McDonough style. And then there's those that are all about the process. And man, I love the fact that I can put Walmart up there. I mean, they are doing more to revolutionize supply chain right now than any governmental regulation ever has with their Sustain 360 program. I mean, the power of adding that list of questions for in every RFP to every vendor about what's your carbon footprint, what's the content of recyclability, where do you make it, what are your shipping costs, where do you ship it from? I mean, someone said to me recently, they said, oh, you don't really think they pay attention to that. And my reaction was, you know what? I don't care if Walmart doesn't pay attention to it, because the vendors do. The vendors want to get into Walmart. And you know what else? The vendors are going to map to that, and they're not going to do it two different ways. When they go to sell to Target or somewhere else, it's going to be the same product, better packaged, better ingredients, more recyclable, shipped less far, more sustainable. And then you have this sort of new breed of certification that's come up. It's not a legal form, but B corporations are companies that have been certified as good companies as opposed to companies that just have good marketing. And so Jay Cohen-Gilbert and Andrew Kasoy and Bart Houlihan started this about 6 years ago. It's actually, they're great marketers. It's really taken off. People recognize the B logo now as sort of a good housekeeping seal for this kind of a company. And someday it might even be a sustainable business model for these guys. These are some of the B Corps that are out there. But look, we don't want to talk about how to bend the arcs. What we really want to do is we want to come up with a brand new way to draw the straight line to optimize. And so I'm not going to go into these because we're running out of time, but I will tell you that my blog, Brian's blog, and the deck you'll get will have these on here. I'm not a fan of L3Cs. I think that benefit corporations are a real hit in the right direction. Whether they do it well and do it perfectly, I think that's yet to be determined. They're relatively new. They've now been passed in 4 states, Maryland, Vermont, Virginia, and New Jersey, and it's pending in 8 others. And then California, as Brian said, I co-chaired the legislative effort in California to create the Flexible Purpose Corporation with some other great lawyers. And I think this is closer to the mark, but I come at it with enough humility to know that when when our working group was making this sausage, it was not a pretty process. And as a result, you know, I would be hard pressed to say this is perfect. But again, there are some public policy decisions underlying it that I think are really powerful in terms of unleashing directors to be more aspirational, rather than thinking about fiduciary duties as, how can I avoid getting sued? And instead thinking about, how can I help the organization, the planet, and the people flourish? The number one thing you need to know is now John's picture creeped up there, but John Wayne, you know, he just came out with simple truths all the time, and the truth is, life is harder if you're stupid. It's just a fact. And I must say, I get the great opportunity almost every week to have some Stanford student show up in my office, passionate, wildly passionate about saving the world and using capitalism to do it. And some of them don't have a clue. They really don't. And I've gotten to the point where I'm trying to build a bigger ecosystem of lawyers because I don't really have the time and the inclination to work with people who aren't thinking smartly about this. And like I said before, this is hard work. And it means you got to be really, really smart because you're trying to do something that's many times more difficult than just setting up a company. It's actually sort of sad. But I've been ending my presentations for the last 2 years with this as a way to say my apologies to the generation of my daughters, the 15 to 30-year-olds who are inheriting a planet that is a lot more messed up than when I inherited it. The thing I would say, though, is that that group of people is, I've started calling them the justice generation. It's not my term. Coined it from a guy named Gary Howe. If you might know, some of you might know him. Very involved in the human trafficking space. And the reason I think they're the justice generation is because, yes, they're cynical. They've grown up with more access to more information at that age than any other generation in the history of mankind. They're painfully aware of how broken the world is and the path that it's on and the way we've been doing things is leading us to a worse place. The great thing about this group is they're not demoralized by that. In fact, the opposite. They're impassioned about doing things differently, about being creative, about trying to come up with solutions for being a part of healing the world. And it's a challenge to me and makes me humble every day to be in the midst of those people. And I like to say there's a movement going on that doesn't yet know it's a movement, but it's being led by that generation. And us baby boomers, we have something to contribute because we've got the wisdom of having been very idealistic, become incredibly narcissistic and real consumers, and now as we enter into our sunset years, dare I say it, we start to think about our legacy. What are we leaving behind? And there's other people to come along too. There's the people in the middle. I call them the strength of the thing. The kids are the heart, the kids. The 15 to 30-year-olds are the heart. The baby boomers are the head. The strength comes from the technologist generation. This group of sort of 30 to 45-year-olds who started out in their 20s to change the world. They thought they were going to change the world with technology, and they did, but not the kind of change they were hoping for. But in the meantime, they've created the greatest accumulation of wealth in that age group that's ever existed in the history of mankind. And that is powerful strength, and they're not giving up on wanting to change the world. So you see Jeff Skoll and Pierre Omidyar, and you see Eric, you see Sergey Brin, and you see these young entrepreneurs, these technologists who are taking their fortunes and saying, okay, that was fun. I could do that again. But is that it? Really? No, I really want to change the world. How do I change the world? How do I make it so that there aren't a billion people living on less than $1 a day? And then there is one last component, because you wouldn't have integrity if it was just head and strength and heart. There is a soul to this puzzle. And what I say is that people of faith understand something that the other three categories don't inherently understand. People of faith understand that they want to do good because that's the way they were made. They were made in the image of God. And they want to do good, and the people of faith have thought about what is good? How do I know what is good? How can I tell the difference between what is good and what is bad? And it's not about them getting involved and getting into the mix to preach anything. It's about sort of walking that out and being the integrator of three distinct silos of age groups, whereas people of faith sort of span them all. And what I like to say is that this is a movement that scares lots of people and should excite all of us, because I think at the end of the day, it holds a lot of promise for our planet.
Amen. Preach it. Well done.
We have time for some questions. So I'd say just go ahead and stand on up if you have one. You're going to have to talk loudly. I'm not going to run toward you with the microphone. And feel free to address it to either John or Todd, or just ask it of us generally.
Can you discuss a little bit around the regulatory issues that help provide an environment for corporations that are trying to do good. You mentioned a little bit about Benefit Corporation being in 4 states, and then in California, you're doing some work down there. But from what I understand, places like the UK, they have a certain tax structure that provides for incentives for companies to enter into this space, whereas we don't have sort of a nationalized structure like that in terms of the regulatory environment. Can you discuss how that informs or how that maybe impedes entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs today for setting up shop in this kind of space?
No. No, this is a no regulation zone. No, just joking. So you're referring to Community Interest Corporation in the UK is what I suspect, and I'll let Todd address some of it. I know in Philadelphia right now, the city has passed a tax break for certified B Corps. That's the only one I've heard of any sort of governmental tax break accompanying the regulatory structure.
It's a question that I've avoided like the plague. Not that someone shouldn't care passionately about it and deal with it, because it's a fair question to ask. If a nonprofit's entitled to a deduction for donations and a for-profit is not, what do you do in the middle, right? And that's, you might say, well, you dial that along and there's a good public policy reason why in the middle should get something. The reason I stay away from it is, number one, I'm not a tax lawyer. Number two, the policy battle is not to be underestimated. In fact, the California Nonprofits Association has just come out with a letter opposing the Flexible Purpose Corporation statute in California, and it doesn't offer any tax breaks. But why did they oppose it? They opposed it because they said, well, it might take away donations from our organizations. And likewise, when you start to see businesses or business-like enterprises that are getting tax subsidies, there's quickly going to be real businesses that aren't getting tax subsidies who are going to start to complain. And some of us in the room are old enough to remember a congressman named Claude Pepper, who every year, I think he must have been in the House for 180 years. Every year he would hold a hearing on unrelated business income tax. And he'd haul up the sisters of whatever order who were doing a sheet washing and folding service out of the hospital that was a nonprofit hospital. And Jerry's dry cleaning from down the street. And they would sit there and testify against one another and all the harm they were each doing to the other one. And so it's just not something I'm prepared to get involved in, but I know there are people thinking about it, and it's also happening at a federal level. This administration has actually set up some offices within Commerce, the Small Business Administration, and even the Social Innovation Office in the White House that have all been kicking around ideas of how can the governmental resources be used to help kickstart, especially the soft costs, the startup costs, help to kickstart these kinds of enterprises.
And just real briefly, and then we'll move on to the next question. Todd touched very briefly on the L3C. At some level, the L3C, while not aiming to get a tax break, the goal of it was to attract program-related investments from private foundations into for-profit companies. As Todd stated, it hits some of the mark and misses most of it.
Yes, actually a comment for Todd. I'm Steve with World Vision. And so lest people go out and burn your toms, just a comment, and as you said, I thank you for your presentation. It takes time. And we're the biggest distributor of toms, and they do have a factory in Ethiopia, which they're trying to run despite grid problems and access to water and access to markets. And they are working with World Vision and their other distribution partners to try and identify countries in which they can set up manufacturing. But it takes time. So
absolutely, I agree.
So maybe look at your slide and talk about it afterwards. But
I've created this presentation for 8 years, and I've been using that and blogging about it. I think they went in about 1.5 years ago into Ethiopia.
We've been working with them for about that time, so I know they have had it there at that time. Tom's has been in business they're coming up on their 5-year anniversary.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you look at, from the perspective, global perspective of the World Bank and all the money that's gone into these undeveloped countries over the decades, it's been billions of dollars, and we still have huge domesticus, right? Now those issues have gotten worse. And the corruption of all of it. And then you look at what essentially this type of movement, which is more grassroots kind of effort. But it comes back to this question, Tom's a great example. Until you solve the, you've got to have the shoes so you don't get the parasites, and if you don't have the food, and then they have the food and they have the shoes, but the water's contaminated, so they're getting sick anyway. I mean, where do you guys see sort of the coordination happening so that we have a whole systems approach here? Because I think the grassroots part is really critical. Important. It hasn't worked the other way. If it was going to work by coming top down and billions coming in from the UN and all that kind of stuff, it would work. There's been enormous money thrown in. So you come over to the grassroots level and say, okay, this all makes sense, but how do you get to a whole systems kind of approach?
I think Todd actually addressed part of it in the way that he was talking about what it means to truly go to the people with humility. One of a saying that has kind of guided a lot of my thought on the issue is go to the people, live among them, learn from what they have, add to what they know, and at the end of the day, whatever you have accomplished, they will say we have done it ourselves. So it starts with humility. It starts with truly understanding their whole life, because once you understand their whole life, you understand those different elements of the fields and the shoes and everything else. But I welcome other comments.
Well, is there an effort, though, I totally agree with that. But now you see, okay, well, this group is doing a water project, and these folks want to do this. I mean, how do you come together?
It
so
may not be
you're really you're really creating a solution.
Adam Smith did the example of the pencil, right? And the reason the free market system is so powerful is that you would never get all of the elements that go into a pencil to actually make a pencil and coordinate it together if it weren't for sort of the profit motive, because there's so many pieces of the puzzle and so many things that have to happen, but the profit motive actually has it all coordinated so that you can finally get a pencil. The biggest challenge around all of the money, when you say all the money, and there's been tons, and I blogged on this about a year and a half ago, I asked whether philanthropy was killing Africa. I like to be provocative, and Steve probably has some stories too, but when you talk about all the money, the biggest chunk of it is governmental aid. Well, the most money we send to Ethiopia is military aid. And we're supporting a prime minister who's really been harsh on the opposition, to be as kind as I can. But his country sits in a place that's a really hard place, surrounded by Sudan, Somalia, Djibouti, and an enemy, a rival, Eritrea. The only friendly neighbor is Kenya. So Ethiopia is a really, really hard place, just to take an example that I know. Most of the rest of the money that goes in there is directed less to try to have an impact on the ground than it is to help businesses here. So, I'm not sure that it will ever be the case that we're going to find some governmental or philanthropic effort that sort of meta-level organizes all the goodwill that Americans and other people in the developed world have to want to help people in the developing world. And that's part of why I put a lot of sort of hope into business models, especially where, like Tom's building a factory in Ethiopia, or our friend Scott James at Fairtrade Sports, building soccer balls in Africa for Africa that are made to live in the dirt and the rocks and the streets of Africa, not the ones that are made for here that would pop in 10 seconds.
Let me add on, if I could. It's a great question, more from the entrepreneur's perspective, because honestly, when I start to think about what it would take to bring it integrated, holistic, it makes my head hurt and I want to go take a nap. But I think for those of you who are motivated to actually start your own thing and carve off your own little piece, there's one super important thing you can do, and that is take some steps to avoid inefficiency and duplication by learning from other people who've already gone down the road you're going down. And I'll just give you an example. I've been out of the day-to-day operations of Pura Vida for 3.5 years. And I'm still averaging about 3 to 4 phone calls a month or emails from people who are all essentially saying the same thing. Hey, I just got back from fill in the blank, mission trip, spring break, family trip to the coffee farm, and wow, if we could just take the coffee from fill in the blank and bring it back to this country and sell it to our friends in fill in the blank, church, school, nonprofit, we could send double the money, right? You get the picture. It's reinventing the wheel, and it's happening a little bit less frequently now, in part because I'm harder to find, but also because the good news is, as these guys both said, there's more of an ecosystem. There are more opportunities to share information and exchange information, so that before you launch your own thing, which entrepreneurs are sort of wired to do, you sort of pause. And it's been really nice to say, well, instead of finding a way to airlift a container of coffee back from Rwanda, what if you partner with this co-op that's already got a container load on that ship, with this roaster who's already set up to toll roast, with this distributor who can already get you on the shelf, and then you start to see a little more
So that's what I'm
efficiency.
getting at, and without going the meta or the government route, because that's what's been going on, it hasn't worked. Who's out there? Is there a group out there starting to connect the dots and?
I think there
Is
are
there-
multiple groups coming at it from different angles, and Todd's more in it than I am, but I think even, the whole idea behind B Corp, J. Cohen Gilbert was one of my early investors, and we took a long walk in Philadelphia where that idea hatched. He said, wow, what if we became sort of the good housekeeping seal, not only to give customers a sense of confidence that the products they're buying are good, but so that we can start to connect members of our community. So when somebody has an idea for, let's say, environmentally sensitive toner cartridges, and they eventually find their way to Jay because he's good at PR, they'll say, oh, we need to connect you with, these guys, the office product guys, and we need to connect you with 7th generation. And so I'm seeing more information sharing, more collaboration, and I don't think it's clear where that go-to place is yet. But we're also fortunate too. Last thing I would say is I think Seattle is becoming a nexus for a lot of that between the Gates Foundation and PATH, Global Partnerships, Agros, World Vision, Mercy Corps. There's a lot happening here that I think creates at least a condition for better exchange of information.
Hi, my name's Jennifer, and I have a question about. I'd like to get some specific examples of how you're able to switch language so that way you can speak to different audiences. So, for instance, I'm working on a project right now with a team in India for solar energy, and saying the word profit when we're talking about this business does not resonate with our contact. So we had to figure out a way to switch the language so that way you could understand what we were trying to say.
Do you have someone on the ground in India working with you?
Yeah, in Bangalore.
And are they sort of directly wired in to the organization, or are they sort of your interpreter on the ground?
He is the organization and the interpreter.
Okay.
So for me, it's much easier to envision when I can hear specific examples of the way that you actually restructured an organization or change your language so that a different community could understand. So can you speak to some specific examples that you had with that?
Sorry.
Well, I would say, and I don't know, we could take it offline too, but there are phrases like earned income, or we want this business to be self-sustaining, or this business, if it's going to do everything that we want it to, it has to be financially self-sufficient in order to continue to go and grow without depending on infusions of other people's money or language around that. I don't know. I tend to be more like Todd, provocative, and I like a good argument. And I'm maybe the wrong guy to ask, because I would say, I don't think profit should be something we're afraid to talk about. And in fact, as the financial investor who really, in a sense, enabled Pura Vida to continue on, who's an SPU grad, he put it to me and he goes, look, you know, all this talk about, you know, mission-mindedness. He used to call me the minister of sunshine. He would say, many of you know who I'm talking about now. You know, he would say, look, you know, let's just be really clear. Without profit, there is no mission, at least in the case of our organization. And so let's just call a spade a spade. And if someone needs to be laid off because that function is no longer necessary or economically viable, yeah, it hurts. But when we talk about the clarity and the rigor and the discipline and the occasional pain that comes with being tough-minded, there we go.
And we have time for one more question. We're actually over time, but
So we had said Lindsay had the last question, and then we'll.
This might be a really good question since we're out of time, but I'm curious what the business model is like with Vida now, and maybe comparing it to how it's changed.
It is. I would say it runs a lot more and looks a lot more like a business. You know, the new owner came in, and I'm still on the board. I'm still active, but you know, he respects the physics, and I guess that was another thing I wanted to leave you with. Every business has physics that it has to adhere to, whether you admit it or not. It's only a matter of time before those physics exert themselves on the business. And so the company has 6 employees instead of 22. It outsources its own roasting instead of trying to do it itself. And guess what? It's profitable. And I would say the thing I would leave you all with is that in my myopia and my own focus on trying to get the business to work just right, you know, I think I missed for a long time a much greater truth. And that truth, I think, is that business is often just a very easy, natural, convenient, low-risk way to initiate a conversation. Right? If I ask you to buy a bag of my coffee for $10, that's not scary. You can say yes or no, you can try it. That's an easy conversation to get into. Then if I ask you to consider coming and sitting at my table at a benefit for the Northwest AIDS Foundation that I happen to support, and would you consider buying a ticket for $50? That's a scary, risky conversation. And this didn't really hit me until Chris and I went back to Harvard. We were invited back, ironically, by the same professor who ripped the dollar bill, who became the first chair of the social enterprise program. We thought we were being invited back so he could show students what not to do when they graduate. And we met with one of our former classmates who was a managing partner at Bain in Boston. And she said, gosh, I'd love to help you guys. What can I do? And you know, we said, oh, we've got to get the business to where the volumes are sufficient to break even, and would you be able to get us into Bain? And she goes, well, yeah, I think so. I was going to give you a check for $5,000 though. We're like, wait a sec, we'll take that too. But at that time, and this is shocking to believe, and I still can't bear to barely admit it, we didn't provide a vehicle or forum or a format to receive people's gifts. There wasn't even an address on the website that would enable somebody to just send money in. And so what really sustained the mission portion of our business until we finally hit profitability and sustainability was just inviting the customers who came in through the coffee door to learn more about what was happening, to hear from Chris, to see stories and photos and videos. And guess what? More and more of them kept saying, wow, I'll buy the coffee, but where do I send my money? And it finally ended in a beautiful way with one of the guys who just learned about our business, lives in Franklin, Tennessee, and has made multi-year, 6-figure gifts to support the work